Hi everybody, thank you so much for coming today and welcome to our latest event. So we are the BAFTSS Horror Studies Subject Interest Group and we run these events about once a month, and we're really delighted to see so many of you here and a very warm welcome to our panel as well here tonight to talk about British horror fiction of the 1970s and 1980s. I'm really looking forward to this one. You can type your questions and comments through the chat throughout the talk, and they'll be picked up in the second half of the event. I'm going to hand over to our chair and disappear. So our chair tonight is Dr. Neil Jackson, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Lincoln. I'm going to hand over to Neil and leave things with him. Thanks, Neil.
All right, thanks, Laura. Hi, good evening, everybody. So welcome to what's the third roundtable discussion for this BAFTSS Horror Studies Special Interest Group. What I'm going to do by way of introductions is to get each panelist to introduce themselves. But I'd just like to say hello myself first to Sorcha, Johnny, Keith and Simon. And if I can ask you first, Sorcha, if you just give us a very brief idea of who you are and what it is you do.
So I'm Sorcha Fhlainn. I'm a senior lecturer in film studies and American studies at Manchester Met, and my research specialism is Clive Barker. For the purposes of tonight's discussion, I also work a lot on vampires and popular culture and Hollywood cinema more generally.
Thank you. And Johnny?
Hello. Hi, everybody. I'm Johnny Walker, senior lecturer in media at Northumbria Uni. And my research specialism is essentially British media cultures, with a specific focus on horror cinema, but at the moment I'm writing a book on the video revolution in Britain, and I also happen to enjoy reading horrible horror fiction as well.
Okay,
I just happen to like that.
And Keith.
Hello. I'm Keith O'Sullivan. I have just finished but not submitted a PhD on the novels and novellas of Ramsey Campbell. So that is why I'm here. Thank you.
And last but not least, certainly, Simon.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Simon Brown. I'm Associate Professor of Film and TV at Kingston University. I started off my academic career doing early British cinema, and then decided that I wanted to write something that someone might actually read. So I switched tacks to horror, and I spent the last 5 or 6 years writing about Stephen King, and now, as you can see from behind me, I've decided to focus on my other passion from my youth, which is James Herbert, and that's why I'm here.
Okay, thanks everybody. So what I think we'd do to start tonight then is to get each of you to elaborate upon your particular point of focus. For those of you who aren't aware, who haven't read the blurb, we're going to be looking at 4 authors in particular tonight: James Herbert, Ramsey Campbell, Clive Barker, and Sean Hudson. And each of our panelists is specializing in one of those particular areas. So I'm going to start by asking Sorcha, how did you come to meet Clive Barker, as it were, and you know, what was your way into Clive Barker?
I think it probably was when I was much younger. I used to frequent lots of video stores as a kid. It was one of my favorite places to be. And I was always fascinated by the artwork of Hellraiser. I always thought that was incredible and really, really forbidding, like really scary. And as someone who kind of worked up her nerve as a teenager, I eventually did get to see Hellraiser. And that was really the gateway, I think, through into his work. So that and his novels. I think the first piece of work I read by him was probably, I'm thinking now, it's probably Hellbound Heart and then Weave World. But that opened up, that was like, you know, the gateway drug into working on Clive more generally. In 2011, I had a conference on Clive in Trinity College Dublin, and there we were able to actually host Clive and get him to, you know, confront the idea that actually he was a subject in academia, that we were people like myself and some scholars there were really interested in actually exploring. So yes, he got to kind of meet his critics, and I think he was quite bowled over by that. So it was very exciting. So it's that way. I'm still working on Clive's work today. It's an ongoing passion, and certainly one I think that he continues to kind of brim that enthusiasm up in me, I must say. So that's kind of where it started, and this is where we are today.
Okay, thank you, Sorcha. And Johnny, how did you come into contact with Sean Hudson then?
Well, let us put it this way. I didn't walk into a video shop, see the adaptation of Slugs and think, oh, I need to check this guy out. It was, I mean, I was a literature student doing literature and film studies. We were reading huge novels, Moby Dick, Bleak House. And one day I walked into everybody's favorite budget high street retailer, The Works, and was confronted by a wall of pulpy fiction, remaindered perhaps, I don't know. But every Sean Hudson title seemed to be there. And I bought Slugs and I read it in between shifts of reading Moby Dick, basically, as a distraction. And the rest is history. I mean, I was always an avid reader of the Dark Side magazine in the late 90s, a collector of all this stuff. And when I discovered Hudson's Slugs and went back through back issues of the Dark Side and whatnot, I sort of realized that this guy, even though he was disreputable and nobody in the field seemed to like his stuff very much, he was a hugely popular author with a massive readership and was featured in the magazine that I loved. So I was immediately drawn to this underdog of British horror fiction. So that is my anodyne tale as to how I was introduced to the bowels of British horror fiction. Really, it was The Works.
I realize that historically I'm kind of working backwards here. So Keith, you're writing, researching Ramsey Campbell, who of course predates Hudson and Barker.
Yeah.
How did you first come into contact with Ramsey?
It was in the early 90s via Lovecraft. And somebody recommended to me a mid-80s novel called The Hungry Moon, which I devoured in one sitting. And for those who don't know it, it's a fusion of Lovecraft's wonderful cosmic horror with a kind of ensemble, small town horror tale that Stephen King has specialized in at various points in his career, which Ramsey has spoken about, this novel being an imitation of. And from there, I finished my master's dissertation on Lovecraft, and I just consumed every novel and every short story of Ramsey's that I could get hold of. And he's written a hell of a lot, over 300 short stories and over 40 novels. But he's represents very much a dichotomy or a paradox, because on the one hand he's been described as Britain's most respected writer of horror fiction, and he's won every award in the field going. But on the other, the amount of scholarship that's been devoted to him is still, nearly 30 years later, very, very, very limited. There's been one monograph, a good monograph by S.T. Josie, and many, many essays on individual works, particularly the short stories, which tend to be higher rated. So I wanted to redress the balance. So that's where I've come from.
Okay. And finally, Simon, we're kind of a similar generation, as it were, and as it seems to be for you, for me, James Herbert was a first point of contact for literary horror back in the 70s when we were growing up. So how did you come into contact with James Herbert?
Yeah, I mean, having spent so much time studying Stephen King, I'm always struck by the fact that I came to James Herbert first. And like a lot of my generation, I think I started reading Herbert by mistake, because I picked up a copy of The Fog thinking that it was the novelization of the John Carpenter film, which was one of the first films I rented when we got our first VHS player in 1983. Unlike, I think, probably most of my generation, the interesting part of this story is that my mum and I saw it, and we bought 2 copies and we read the book together. And I was 13, so she was very good about that, and I think we both got to the infamous scene in the gymnasium around about the same time. But then the following year in '84, I went to Forbidden Planet, back in the days when Forbidden Planet was 2 shops, and And James Herbert was doing a signing there of Domain, which was the third book in the Rats trilogy, which was the new one at that time. And he was just so nice. I'd gone there with like 7 books, as you do. And this, stooge by the door said, "Oh, Mr. Herbert will only sign 1." And so I was basically standing in the queue trying to figure out which one I wanted to get signed. And he just waved me over and he said, "What's the matter?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know which one to get signed." I was really shy. And he went, "Oh, for God's sake, put them all down. I'll sign all of them. Don't worry about it." And we just chatted for a bit and he was lovely. And I've, been buying his books, every one that came out ever since. And I've always wanted, since getting into horror, to do something about him, but I didn't feel I had the vocabulary that I needed to do that. And now I feel like I do, which is why I've sort of come to him. Because having finished Stephen King, I then went, okay, let's see what's written about James Herbert. And I just fell into this void of nothing. And where the hell is all this stuff? So yeah, that's how I came to him.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I can recall in the 70s, my own father, who was by no means a fan of horror fiction, even he read some James Herbert. I could distinctly remember him reading The Fog and The Survivor, and those books being lying around, but always being just a little bit too afraid to pick them up because of those rather lurid covers.
Well,
okay.
I remember specifically the book I read before I read The Fog, the last children's book I ever read, was Doctor Who and the Sea Monsters by Terry Dix. So I went from Famous Five to Doctor Who to James Herbert.
Yeah, so that's a kind of graduation, as it were. Okay, so I'll kind of throw this open to everybody who wants to try and answer this question. But what I want to know is, what was the state of play for British horror fiction at that point before these writers started becoming popular and started appearing, in some cases, of course, on the bestseller list? We tend to think of a certain kind of tradition in British horror, which goes, right back, to Mary Shelley, and we think of the British Gothic horror tradition. But what was the state of play in the 1970s before these writers came along? Anybody?
I can start on that. I mean, really, there's like 2 names to kind of flag up at this point, and obviously the big one is Dennis Wheatley, who in the early 70s was the sort of biggest selling horror writer around, and had obviously had at least one relatively well-respected Hammer adaptation, which was The Devil Rides Out in '68, I think. And there was another one called The Uncharted something or other, which was one of those kind of Lost World stories.
Uncharted Seas, yeah.
Uncharted Seas, yeah. And, Wheatley, obviously, he very strange character, very interesting character. But he was writing all of these stories with the Duc de Richelieu and his band of merry, sort of incredibly wealthy people running around the countryside, visiting sort of humongous estates in order to stop other wealthy people from worshipping Satan. And he was very much the most popular figure. But the other kind of key figure I think is worth mentioning, and Johnny and Sorcha and Keith may have others here, but is Herbert Van Thal with his, was it the Puffin Book of Horror or the Pelican Book of Horror, the Penguin Book of Horror, those kind of anthologies. Because they were the ones that were released with these incredibly lurid covers, and they'd come out like once a year, and you had these real kind of pulpy covers, which sort of, I think, a lot of this sort of post-Herbert literature was riffing off of. But those I think were really the 2 big names, and Van Thal's stuff was more gory, more down to earth, more pushing in the direction of the kind of extremity that we would see in the latter part of the decade, I think.
I mean, you mentioned Dennis Wheatley there. I think it's also interesting that it was a Dennis Wheatley adaptation that marked the end, more or less, of Hammer's involvement in horror film as well, with To the Devil a Daughter in the mid-70s as well. So it's a kind of a nice kind of transitional point, I suppose, in that regard. Has anybody else got any insights on that particular issue with regards to, what else was happening in British horror fiction at that point in time?
I think Simon makes the good point insofar as that the narratives of Dennis Wheatley, the status of Dennis Wheatley, and the fact that The Devil Rides Out still remains, in the opinion of many, Hammer's greatest film. It epitomizes the state of British horror, generally speaking, as something which was associated primarily with specific versions of aristocracy and whatnot. And also, the fact that by this point, by the time we get to like 1974 and the publication of the Rats, what's clear is that the Rats signifies such a significant break with what had gone before. I mean, around about the same time we had in terms of, in the filmic sense, the likes of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and these other films overseas, bringing horror into the modern day, exploring different class dynamics, and Pete Walker in the United Kingdom. But really, that moment, that pivotal moment, 1974, with the publication of the Rats, marks a significant turning point insofar as that it brings horror into the present day and also makes it perhaps more politically charged than it had been in the previous few years.
Right.
Well, I mean, you could say that the Dennis Wheatley novels were also politically charged in being very conservative, reactionary, xenophobic, sexist, and all the rest of it. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, Campbell is was very much an early admirer of James Herbert, and praised his class consciousness. And I think there's an element of self-projection as well, that he described him as an Englishman who wasn't afraid to confront these issues in a very, very parochial and national sense. Whereas before, with Wheatley, it had been aristocratic. In fact, the classic ghost story had been a very upper or middle class milieu, and now suddenly it was urban, it was working class or lower middle class, petty office politics, and the drudgery, the mundaneness of everyday life was suddenly there with Herbert and with Campbell as well.
One of the interesting things about Herbert, sorry, Neil, is, if you go through a lot of his works, what you tend to find in a lot of his books is this idea of a kind of working class urban guy, and it's always a guy at the center of his story, who is taken out of his world of like, a London flat and a local pub and his kind of scabby office, and has to go out to the country to some sort of gigantic aristocratic estate, which is where all the evil is situated. And you can see this in Haunted, you can see this in Sepulchre, you can see this in Ash. It's, it's a theme. So, I mean, the Rats is entirely urban set and contemporary set. But this sort of puncturing and railing against the kind of traditional sort of aristocracy, I think is partly political, but I also see that as a bit of a kind of reaction to the kind of things that Wheatley was doing. Not that Herbert didn't necessarily hate Wheatley, but I think, part of his kind of democratization of horror in a way was about puncturing that portentousness.
I think it's interesting as well. Peter Straub is someone who needs to be mentioned here as well, because I know that Straub was someone who influenced Barker in some respects, and I think that although Straub and King were obviously having their own partnership, I think that Straub was also a neighbor of Barker's when Barker was a student. So I think he lived 13 doors down, and I think there's something in the ether around the time that they're actually writing. So when Straub is he published Ghost Story at that point, I think, but when they're writing around kind of the urban horror of London, I think it's really interesting that the two of them pick up on something very much in the cultural ether around 1980, 1981. So probably sort of that backlash of Thatcher, that kind of initial Thatcher government, and how desperate it might have felt for artists and young people, young creatives. So I think that it just comes a little bit after Wheatley, but I think there's something to that in terms of that despair that was felt at the time, I think.
All right, so elaborating upon that last question then, I'd like to carry on by asking each of you why you think it is each of these authors is so important for the development of British horror fiction, and whether or not they do represent a break with that tradition, or whether it is in some ways a continuation of that tradition as well. So I'll try and take this in kind of chronological order again. So I'll go to you first, Keith, with Ramsey Campbell on this question.
Well, I mean, firstly, Ramsey Campbell identifies very much with the tradition. He, he is very much the heir of Lovecraft, of Arthur Machen, of Fritz Lieber, but he's also equally, and M.R. James as well is another prime influence. But he also looks further afield to wider literary currents. He's indebted to Nabokov, to Burroughs and Miller, and the French New Novel. And I think, I made a couple of notes on this, and his really distinctive qualities are, I think, fourfold. Firstly, there's a highly distinctive use of a very personal language, a distinct style, and Josie calls him the poet of urban squalor and decay, which is very, very apt, I think. And secondly, it's, as we've discussed before, this is what he did in the 70s and 80s in particular, was he really addressed the urban grunge, the decay, the blitz of his native Liverpool, and it reinterpreted that in a way that it hadn't been addressed before. And I mean, there are two other things. I mean, he's very much introduced or reintroduced psychological horror into horror fiction. The Face That Must Die, for example, is one of the best studies, I think, of the paranoid schizophrenic in literature. And fourthly, he's not afraid, and this is where I think critics like David Punter have perhaps misread him. He's not afraid of being ambiguous and having unresolved endings. This is part of the early 70s, for downbeat endings. But Punter's criticised him for not knowing what he was doing. But actually, I think Campbell had very much taken inspiration from Robert Eichmann in particular, and also filmmakers like Alain Renoir, Last Day at Marinabat. Where the enigma, the journey, is more important than the resolution or the story. I mean, somebody like Stephen King would look, always prioritizes the story. That's probably why he's successfully so much more commercially successful than Campbell is. But for Campbell, it's the experience, it's the tone, it's the journey, the evocation of psychological states that is more important, the atmospherics, if you like. Sorry, I've rambled, but there we are.
No, that's fine. I mean, it seems that you're ascribing real literary value to Ramsey Campbell in that sense. And I think that's a nice lead into asking Simon about James Herbert, somebody who was, of course, deemed to have no literary value whatsoever by the rather snooty critics who received his work as it was published. So Simon, if you could just elaborate yourself about why is James Herbert so important?
Well, I mean, yeah, just to pick up on what Keith said there, I mean, Campbell did actually rate Herbert, which was quite nice. It was Martin Amis who dismissed him completely in the first review of the Rats. I mean, the thing about Herbert, to me, the way I see him, is nothing more than a flat out kind of revolutionary. Stephen King called him like a punk author. Kind of compared him to the Sex Pistols, which was something that Herbert really objected to, partly because he was an old-fashioned rock and roller and didn't like punk at all. But I think that's true. What he did is he threw out the rule book and he just wrote. Here's a guy who had never written a book before, sat down and wrote The Rats on the weekend because he just needed a challenge. Sent it off to 6 publishers, and a year later it was out in print. And it is this vicious, visceral, no holds barred. A baby gets eaten by the rats in chapter 3, right? You don't have to wait for this stuff to happen. It's like it signals to itself, right, here we go. You're used to, you know, aristocrats worshipping Satan in their underpants. Here's a baby being eaten by rats. And he has this incredibly, what's the word? This style that is just pure momentum. You know, the plots just run and run and run from chapter to chapter, and interspersed with the plot are these little vignettes where we're introduced to a character, given this what is often very kind of interesting sort of inner lives, which give you a real glimpse of kind of some sort of kind of private underbelly of British society at that time. You know, someone who's having an affair, somebody who, you know, is trying to earn money by nefarious means or whatever it is, and then they die, they're killed by whatever the hell the big bad is in the book, and then the plot moves on and we get another couple of chapters of that, and then there's another vignette, and it just, they all go along like that. And so, you know, he starts off in the 70s as this punk author that sort of rushes in, throws everything out, and just kind of screams in the reader's face, even through the covers, which he designs himself. And no one can possibly deny that this is, like, you know, the iconic kind of book cover of the 1970s. And yet, you know, once you get past sort of 1982, 1983, he starts to soften. He starts to change the kind of books that he's telling. He goes back to this every now and again, but it seems like in the 80s, he's sort of seeing that there are people out there who are getting a degree of respectability and he's not. And he starts to kind of nudge towards kind of writing a different type of book. But yeah, I think really that's what kind of struck me more than anything. These, you know, particularly those first sort of 6 or 7 books, they are raw, they are powerful, they hold no punches. They're not literary, but they are great stories that are well told. And obviously, you know, just by doing that, and then kind of what follows, he becomes very influential, I think.
Sure. And Sorcha, let me ask you about Clive Barker, because he's a slightly different case study, I suppose, in the sense that he first came to prominence to readers, certainly because of his short stories and the fact that those became, you know, good sellers. I distinctly remember the collections that were available quite widely in the 1980s of those early books of blood short stories. So why is it you think Clive Barker represents such an important progression?
I think it's because he also have a different kind of background, in the sense that Clive was working in avant-garde theatre in the 70s, you know, with the Dog Company, and then was writing plays and had actually had a couple of plays in kind of fringe theatre. And I think that it was a way to break through, was actually the short story fiction was a way to break through. And when he started writing books of blood, what I think is quite interesting about that is that it was something that Sphere, his publishers, really nurtured him. They nurtured him throughout those first few years. So you have the collections of the individual volumes of books of blood. And then it was the discipline of then writing the first novel, which is Damnation Game. And I think while it's not shy on its nastiness, it's absolutely got moments of real horrific kind of not only spiritual void, but also quite fleshy moments as well. I think what's really interesting about it is that he is not writing it he's writing in a very authentic voice for him. It's very literary and it's very polished. You can tell it's possibly the most polished novel that he's brought out, in the sense that you can tell every comma has been literally considered. And I think for that, he kind of changes the direction. I mean, I'm not saying that there wasn't respectability before Barker. I think there was, and there was certainly fan investment in horror fiction in Britain more generally. But I think with Barker, it makes it very exportable. It makes it gives it an international flavor. And I think by the time that he gets to his famous endorsement, not only a brilliant endorsement from Ramsey Campbell, who wrote him a glowing endorsement, but then also when he gets the endorsement by King in 84, sorry, no, it might be 85 actually, in Ottawa, at the World Fantasy Convention, that really enables him to travel and be an international author in the fullest sense. So you get that immediate breakthrough because of King's endorsement. It has a huge, I think, ability to market Barker to a whole new set of readers who mightn't have come across him before, but it also becomes a kind of a blessing in disguise as well. Or sorry, should I say a curse in disguise as well. So.
Sure. And finally, Johnny, Hudson is probably the writer amongst this group who has probably had the least in the way of critical praise as far as literary content is concerned. So what is the case you're making for Sean Hudson in that regard? Why is he so important?
Well, I mean, I will say that, the reason that he hasn't been explored in a literary sense is because his books, frankly, aren't all that literary, right? I mean, and that's not to disparage Hudson's writing either. I mean, we could criticize his prose style at length, for sure. But what interests me is the fact that Hudson embodies so perfectly everything that paperback publishers wanted at that time, insofar as that he was writing populist fiction that could be easily marketed and that would and did sell. So Hudson's a phenomenon insofar as that, whereas, we can speak of James Herbert's books as critiques of mid-1970s England as the Rats clearly is, and it's overtly political insofar as that there's this binary between the socialists and the conservatives. Hudson takes the skeleton of the Rats, as it were, and just runs with that and very little else. One of the authors that we haven't mentioned so far, of course, is Guyan Smith, author of Night of the Crabs, which of course famously on the front cover had "In the tradition of the Rats." Now, anybody who's read Night of the Crabs will know that it's not like the Rats. I mean, it's like the Rats insofar as that there is a menace and it's an animal, but that is it, right? The Night of the Crabs is, it's a novel of another time, really. It's not a novel of the 1970s. It feels very old school in the way that it's written. Hudson famously has said numerous times that he read that book as a teenager and thought that if people can if people can make money from writing this shit, I've got a good chance of having a career as a writer myself. And frankly, that's how Hudson initially, at least, approached it. He allegedly fired from all his jobs, fancied his chances as a writer, got a deal to publish a book called The Skull, which sold modestly, and then wrote Slugs. And the rest is history. Interestingly, people don't know this, but Sean Hudson's first novel wasn't a horror book. It was a war novel written under the pseudonym Wolf Kruger. So Sven Hassel, of course, is this big war writer. Hudson was aligning himself with that tradition, and then happened to write a horror novel that a publisher bought. So was writing horror fiction, but was also writing under numerous pseudonyms, different types of books throughout the 1980s. So to return to the question, what interests me about Sean Hudson? Well, he's a popular writer shifting books, and it doesn't matter so much about the literary value, because that's not a concern of Hudson. He's writing popular entertainment, and he's a novelist who doesn't read fiction. Stephen King apparently reads 6 books a month. Sean Hudson does not. If the authors that he likes, he'll cite Thomas Harris or David Morrell or somebody like that. But by and large, he doesn't read fiction and never has, because fiction's his job. It's like a work-life balance, right? It's like fiction, writing a certain kind of fiction is his work that he gets paid for, and he goes to the cinema in his spare time and listens to heavy metal. So the point that I want to make is Hudson can be compared to a shock rock band like Kiss, right? Style. People say that there's very little substance. I'm personally a massive Kiss fan, but it's shock rock, but in literary form, well ahead of the splatterpunk phenomenon as well of the late 1980s. So yeah, that's what interests me about Sean Hudson. It's not so much the content of his books, but more so the way where he sits or where he sat in the market.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure, Johnny, that the Hudson was who Campbell had in mind when he, or one of the people Campbell had in mind when he, disparaged the disgustingness of writers, or people trying to, new writers trying to outdo each other in disgustingness. And of course, there's a wonderful parody in Ancient Images at the very end of the 80s, where the heroine meets a gorehound, a teenage gore fan, who's a disciple of this guy called Andrew Minahan, who writes self-confessed crap, and they've got titles like the slobbering, and it crawls up you and it crawls back up you, and entrails, which they wouldn't let him call puke and die. So there's very much a tussle going on in that decade.
Yeah, for sure. And there's this famous article it's an interview between Hudson and Campbell in The Dark Side in, I think, 1992, 1993. Yeah. And they're not having an argument per se, but clearly Campbell is from a different tradition, and his answers to the questions are very long and eloquently expressed, whereas Hudson is just, I do this for the money.
Yeah.
And which is why people don't, there's not much truck with Sean Hudson, precisely for that reason, because, people find his work not very good. They find him arrogant and dismissive of the literary form. The opposite of Campbell, basically, and the opposite of somebody like Clive Barker, who is able to explore that. Barker aligned himself with the splatterpunks. He is able to explore the viscera, but in a more eloquent and literary fashion, shall we say.
I think what's really interesting listening to you all is, despite the fact that we've kind of grouped these writers together as effectively a movement, a very loosely defined movement in horror fiction, that there is such a range of diversity within terms of style, within terms of reception. But what I want to move on to now is the kind of the thematic core of each writer's work. And we've talked a lot about narrative today already, but what I want you all to elaborate upon, what are the chief thematic elements that emerge from each of these writers' work? And I'll start with Sorcha. We're going to move backwards with this, I think. Clive Barker, thematically, what were his central concerns as a writer?
He's very, very concerned throughout each of the phases of his career, because there have been numerous sort of movements and phases within his career as well. And I think whether it's in art or literature, film, he's really obsessed with the idea of transcendence. He's really interested in the idea of shifting and changing the body, twisting it up, making it interesting, pushing possibilities and boundaries. He's obviously very deeply invested in the sexual. And I mean that in the sense of the full sort of gamut of sexual expression, the idea of flesh and transformation. But he finds it as something that has a profound meditation on the nature, what it is to be human, for all of those kind of sticky, fleshy flaws that we all have. He's really interested in that. So, and maybe a little healthy dose of guilt there from the Irish grandparents. But other than that, I think, in terms of the Catholic kind of, worries about damnation, there is a Judeo-Christian element there as well. But really, it's about transformation, transcendence. He's all about what's it really all about after this fleshy, sticky, mortal coil we're all stuck with.
In a sense, then, is that a real continuation of the tradition to which I've referred to already tonight? The sense of what is there afterwards, which has been central, of course, to many ghost stories.
I would think that he does fit into that. I think the thing, he changes the delivery mechanism. I mean, you don't have the lurid, there are lurid aspects to Barker. I'm not apologizing for that. I think it's just that it's not as potentially as crassly overtly stated as something like Sean Hudson, as Johnny was talking about. I think it's packaged in something that is starting to become, at the very least, it's starting to be literary, and in time it becomes respectable. It's just a question of time passing and a little bit of critical reception. And because he got that critical reception, it enabled him to kind of package it in a way where it was something that could be read and it wouldn't be considered instant trash.
Right. And Johnny, you may well have already answered this question, of course, about Hudson, given the sense that even you, as somebody researching this particular writer, are fully cognizant of his cynicism. Do you think that kind of cynicism belies any kind of deeper thematic integrity, if you can use that word?
I mean, I'm sure if you looked, you could find some stuff. But I mean, you cannot talk about Sean Hudson in the same way that you can talk about Clive Barker, I'm afraid. And that's, you know, because Barker is striving for something. Hudson wants to cash a check, which in a sense, I don't disrespect Hudson for that, because he had a readership. I mean, I'm part of that readership who enjoys his books. You know, and we can maybe compare it to the 50 Shades of Grey phenomenon. You know, everybody said that it was badly written, is a means of denigrating not only the author, but also the audience or the readership of that book, which is bang out of order, in my opinion. I mean, not that obviously there are things that we could talk about 50 Shades of Grey in many different ways, but it's similar with Sean Hudson insofar as that, you know, people are reading this stuff. And I mean, the content of his books, they're very cinematic. They owe a lot to Hammer Films, actually, namely the work of Terence Fisher, insofar as that they're so morally cut and dry. You know, there's good and there's evil and there's very little nuance. Whereas in something like The Rats, it's ambiguous. There's crossover. It's not as clear cut. So in terms of thematics, I mean, these are morality tales where there is a hero and a heroine. The books are profoundly dated and politically incorrect, much like The Rats, actually. And usually at the end of the book, everybody thinks things are okay, but they're not. It materializes. And they're sort of like, Hudson owes a lot to the big horror movies of the period, you know, which have, Andrew Tudor would call it paranoid horror, where there's a hint of resolution, and then that is rapidly swept away. You know, whether it be News in Erebus, which is his best novel in my opinion. There's a small farming community falls victim to this vampiric plague, and the spoiler alert in the final pages, it's reached the world, the globe. It's gone global. There's nothing they can do. Or in Spawn, the end of Spawn, which is about telepathic aborted fetuses. They're still communicating at the end of the novel. But I mean, it's surface level stuff.
And Simon, sorry, John. Yeah.
Sorry, and I was just going to say, and that's the appeal.
Right. Yeah, and Simon, you've already referred quite explicitly to Herbert's reputation as a kind of page turner, but somebody who also kind of became respectable as well. And I revisited some of his novels over the summer during the lockdown, and I certainly could detect a kind of consistent thematic undercurrent to the first few novels that I went back to. But what would you say was the defining essence in terms of Herbert's output overall in that regard?
I think, in a way, it can be summed up really clearly by his last published novel, which was Ash in 2012, which is about David Ash, who's the lead character in Haunted and The Ghosts of Sleeth, this paranormal investigator who goes to this ancient castle in Scotland, which is run by this mysterious group called the Inner Court, and is basically this sort of part sort of ancient castle, part high-tech fortress, in which the worst people and some of the worst people in society go to be sequestered and safe. So Colonel Gaddafi's there, Robert Maxwell's there. There are some Nazis living there. Donald Trump would probably be living there if he'd writing it today. And it's about it's about duality. So it becomes about the difference between city and country. It becomes about the difference between the aristocracy and the wealthy and the ordinary kind of average working guy. And connected to that somehow as a thread running through all the books is those things are then connected to good and evil. And usually to a certain degree, it's the urban and the contemporary and the working class that is good. It's the countrified and the aristocratic that is evil. And then tied to that is the notion of past and present. So what you end up with really is always the tales of these ordinary people with whom we are meant to identify. And I mean, one of the problems with Herbert in a way is that if you're a woman, you're pretty much asked to identify with somebody who treats women like shit, which is something that we can discuss if we want to go down that particular route. But you're asked to identify with this kind of working class professional guy who is then thrust into a world that is country, that is aristocratic, and that is old. And you put those three things together and you basically get evil in some form or another. And I think that's the theme. So in a way, he does something that's relatively quite similar to King, in the sense that King sets up this very ordinary, recognizable and identifiable world and then thrusts something sort of disruptive into it. But what Herbert does is takes an ordinary recognizable character out of an ordinary recognizable world and puts them in a world that we can't recognize, where everything around them is fundamentally threatening, and where they are at the mercy of all of the forces that we are at the mercy of. We're at the mercy of the past. We're at the mercy of the people with money. You know, I think that's the main theme, and that really runs through all of his works, you know, and the balance between them kind of shifts, but that's the fundamental theme.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, Neil.
No, go ahead, carry on, Keith.
No. I think that there's some common ground with Campbell there. Definitely, I think unlike the others, the themes in Campbell's fictions have been pretty consistent. He's spoken about them at length in interviews as well. The vulnerability of children, the family, the willingness of people to you know, subscribe, to espouse certain viewpoints and surrender the right to question, and also the propensity to scapegoat, you know, to other minorities. And this is all very, you know, it continues to be relevant with Brexit and right-wing, you know, populist movements. You'd wonder what the antagonist of something like The Face That Must Die, John Horridge, would make of Brexit. I suspect he'd absolutely love it. I think there's a quote from Campbell somewhere to that effect. But he's also very interested. There are those clear themes and this antipathy towards cults and surrendering free will to, you know, to these harmful bodies. And not New Age movements in Campbell's universe are very malevolent. There's also a clear preoccupation with the status of the writer, the subject, and the writer as subject. I mean, this is crystallized at the very end of the 80s, really 1990, with Kneading Ghosts, this extraordinary novella where where the protagonist undergoes this kind of dead of night scenario where he's trapped in a continuing, recurring dream nightmare. He's a horror writer, he's a professional horror writer, and Campbell uses that as a vehicle to, you know, to look at the status of horror fiction and the relationship of horror writers to their audience, and as a kind of in one passage, he's Motterhead, the protagonist, is leaving the house, and he, you know, shouts out, you know, lock your windows, pull down the blinds, or he'll know you're there, you know, as this kind of bogeyman figure. And at the end, at the end of the novella, he's you know, he thinks he may have murdered his entire family, and it becomes a kind of metaphysical dilemma as well. So, you know, and this has been developed more by him in the ensuing decades, where he looks at the status of the subject in an increasingly technological society with all these technological advances in novels like Grin of the Dark and The 7 Days of Cain, and looks at, post-human lives, these creative lives. So yeah, I mean, there are definite consistent themes, but there's also preoccupation with the writer and with audiences and texts and the future of literature. And unlike King, it's done with a very, very paranoid take. At the end of a King narrative, you would expect some resolution. In the very Manichaean narratives with good and evil, divided, and the story is, everything. Campbell is not interested in comforting the audience. He's interested in unsettling them. He's interested in lapses in communication and this very uncomfortable vibe. Sorry.
Oh no, it's great. Thanks, Keith. I'd just like to say we're getting some really good questions in from all of the people who are here tonight as well. But I'll ask you in kind of aggregation then. In response to what you've all just said, to what extent do these books reflect British social conditions of the time in which they were written, when they were published? That may apply more to one or two of these authors than the others, but are they in any way a reliable reflection of British social conditions of the time? I'll throw that open to anybody who wants to answer it.
Yeah, I think The Face That Must Die is almost a kind of Thatcher critique before Thatcher, really. The central figure is this kind of conservative counter cultural monster. He's homophobic, he's xenophobic, he's every kind of phobic you can imagine. And there's also there a kind of critique of what of media constructions of violence and the causes of violence as well. And Campbell doesn't let up on this, because he's still pursuing these concerns 20 years later with the One Safe Place, which is a wonderful social realist novel which analyzes the causes of violence in Anglo-American culture and censorship, media approaches to censorship, which he views as very much an Aunt Sally, as it were, in that the sources of violence are within us, and we need to analyze those causes, not repress video nasties, because people are already have this propensity for violence, and it tends to be right-wing or illiberal politics which brings them out and legitimizes them.
It's interesting that you mentioned the video nasties, actually, Keith, because I think Hudson wrote an anti-censorship essay published in the fanzine Sam Hain in the early 1990s, and I do feel that even though Hudson's novels, at least in the 1980s, are at best politically ambivalent, certainly there is a drive on his own part to offend and shock and to kick back against the immoral oppressors, as it were. So that's one takeaway from Hudson's. Another one is some of his stuff is set in London, and there's one novel, Come the Night, which was written under the pseudonym Nick Blake, which was banned from W.H. Smith, as they all were, in 1984 when it was published under a different title, Chainsaw Terror, because it's pretty grim. So this, anyway, the film's set in Soho, and Hudson goes to pains to make Soho sound the sort of the dingy environment that it was in the 1980s, but there is no explanation why. There is no effort made to dig deeper than that. Soho was presented in this way because that's how Hudson sees it. There is lots of potential in that book if Hudson wanted to explore the moral dynamics surrounding the sex industry, for instance, but he doesn't, and that's what we're left with. Again, it's ambivalent, surface level material, but one that, by the same token, is reflective of people's experiences of those areas in the 1980s.
Sure. Does anybody else want to chime in on that one?
I think Barker is one who's, yes, he's most certainly politically aware, certainly quite horrified by Thatcher, but also quite horrified by the video nasties, in the sense that he was really upset that people thought his fiction would have the same sort of corruptive value as the video nasties. It's a weird kind of moral line to pull, but I think when he was questioned about it at length, when he's interviewed about it, he was really quite upset that people thought that literature would mean that you'd then be so corrupted you go out and you kill somebody with a hammer or a chainsaw or whatever. And he kind of found that to be a really reductive, stupid argument. But what I thought was quite interesting about it was in his own fiction, whether it's Books of Blood, and I think of the opening story, The Book of Blood in particular, it's the fact that you try and politically kind of speak for a group of people while ignoring them, which I think we can all agree is a Tory government move. Mm-hmm. It's something that there's then a immediate form of revenge taken where the stories are literally carved into the flesh of the fake medium. So we have this kind of idea of if you don't want people to rise up, then don't try and misrepresent them. And whether that could be any minority, when you're thinking of the poor, the disenfranchised, the striking miners at the time, but again, equally the LGBTQ community who've been treated appallingly in the 1980s. So you have all those kinds of that force behind it, but it's suitably ambiguous enough for you to pour into it what you feel is the most representative element in Barker's fiction. Another one though is Mrs. Thatcher. She does become a particular a particular target for him. Tim Wallington wrote a fantastic essay on this about Weave World, where it identifies this sort of vicious female power at the center of all this violence in 1980s Britain. The novel it begins in Liverpool. So you very much get this idea of it being thought about and meditated upon after the riots of the 1980s, and what Thatcher kind of did when she sort of targeted the north of England particularly. So he is aware of that. Whether it transcends over into later works, I think it's less acutely felt, as you see in the 80s.
I think that's true of Herbert as well. I mean, The Rats is a very deliberately political novel. The very fact that much of the action takes place in sort of derelict bomb sites in the East End in the early 1970s, these places that have been left empty and undeveloped since the end of the war. And the lead character in the novel is a school teacher who has no skills whatsoever to battle giant mutant rats, except for the fact that he knows the area, he knows the East End, which none of the government people do. Herbert says that the rats are the system that we have to battle. So that's very, very political. But I think it's important with Herbert in particular to realize that sort of drifts away quite quickly. That kind of, it's always there. As I say, this theme of country and city, aristocracy and all that, but it becomes less significant. It becomes less angry. It becomes less visceral, really quite quickly. By the sort of end of the 70s and beginning of the 80s. And then it begins to shift. So you get books that are very much, you get Shrine, which is very much sort of having a pop at the Catholic Church, for instance. But gradually, his political anger begins to dim. And I think what you're left with is stories about characters, but less of a kind of representation of a world, of a country. I don't read a book by Herbert written in the 1980s and get a sense of the 1980s. I just get a sense of the characters. Interestingly enough, however, I think it's worth pointing out that the very last, I'm paraphrasing this, but the very last sentences of the very last book he had published, which is Ash in 2012, are something along the lines of this. Prince Philip turned away from his wife and looked out at the crowds gathered on the Mall. Fuck them, he said. Fuck them all. And that's the last published words he wrote. And you think, okay, so there's something in there that's the last thing that he chose to say. Apologies to anyone who was offended by the language, but I'm quoting, so it's all right.
Yes, indeed, I am deeply offended that you should refer to the royal family in that way, Simon. Well, I'm conscious of the fact you may not be, but we're already on the hour mark. And there's lots of questions pouring in. So I'm going to ask one more question before I start forwarding some of the questions that have been suggested by everybody who's looking in tonight. The final thing I want to ask you is something about reception, and what were the prevailing critical attitudes that led to the dismissal of some of these writers and the acceptance of others, and the undervaluation perhaps of some? Do you think this was a typically English response to horror culture, in general? I'll make that a general question again. Anybody wants to try and tackle it?
What I find it. Sorry, Simon.
No, I was just going to say, I think Johnny had it right when he said earlier that, you know, part of the criticism of the writers was a criticism of the readers. You know, these are paperback books that are, you know, were read on grubby trains in the smoking carriage on your way into work. You know, there's old-fashioned blue ones with the opening doors that you bought on the paperback racks. I don't, yeah, I in a way, you know, you could argue that the real political statements that these novels make is the criticism of them and the implicit criticism of the people who read them.
What I think is interesting, though, is that, you know, publications such as the Times, the Daily Express often reviewed these books very positively, which is interesting given certainly the video nasties panic of the period and how vocal the same publications were, all indeed, you know, the entire media sphere were about those videos. One of the things that I'll say about the critical response to Sean Hudson is that when he was reviewed, either the reviews were terrible, like, you know, if they were presented to a literary critic, but by the same token, a lot of the reviews were, yeah, this is a good page turner, and it does what it says on the tin. So on the one hand, you had the sort of reactionary response to Hudson, which is, this is trash and it could corrupt our children. But on the other side of the coin, you had, oh, here's another rip-roaring thriller from Sean Hudson, what we've come to expect of him. And certainly that's what it is. By the time you get to the 1990s, at least, there's a lot more there's a lot more praise being mounted onto Hudson than in the early 1980s.
Right. So what I'll do then is I'll ask the first question from the group tonight, and the first one is from Kev. He was pretty quick off the mark, and I'll read it verbatim. He says, "Do the panel think there is a correlation between the relative lack of adaptations derived from British sources, perhaps excluding Barker, and a relative lack of British horror films in the 80s and 90s?"
Yes and no, I think. I mean, you know, there are 5 adaptations of Herbert's books, 3 of which were made overseas. One in Australia, one in Canada, and one in America. That's The Survivor, Deadly Eyes, and Fluke. And so the 2 you get made in this country are Haunted and The Secret of Crickley Hall, both of which are very much kind of worked as sort of traditional Gothic, dramas. Crickley Hall is a Sunday night 9 o'clock BBC drama, and the interesting thing about the book is that it's all set in the present, and then you look at the adaptation and it's got, you know, half of it is set in the past with the backstory, and Haunted, the novel, is set in the 1980s and the film is set in the 1920s. So I mean, there's something about the fact that the stuff of his that gets adapted in this country is adapted very much in the kind of, you know, sort of Gothic, the Helen Wheatley style Gothic tradition that Helen writes about. But I think it's worth pointing out here that if you look across the pond at America and you look at Stephen King's contemporaries, most of them don't really get adapted either. You know, there's a handful of a couple of adaptations of Dean Koontz, no adaptations of John Saul, 1 or 2 of Peter Straub. What's quite interesting is that you look across the writers of this period and what you actually find is how few of them have been adapted at all. And there is, in that respect, there isn't the circumstances are different, but there isn't necessarily something unusual about the lack of adaptations of British horror authors.
No, I'd agree with that. I mean, only 3 of Campbell's novels have been adapted so far, all of them in Spain, because of Campbell's friendship networks rather than a Spanish or Catholic attachment, and they've all revolved around narratives that feature female protagonists and dwelt on the vulnerability of the child, you know, the influence, Pact of the Fathers, and the Nameless, and yeah, there is some growth there, but this is 30-40 years after some of these narratives appeared, and I think it's because he's viewed as or has been viewed by Hollywood as just, and this would apply to the others as well, Barker, except Barker, as just too quintessentially British. His style probably creates some problems as well, and also the fact that a lot of his horror is internalized, particularly psychological dramas, and just won't sell to a cinematic audience.
Interesting with Barker, because actually, I mean, there has been adaptations of Barker's work. He just didn't like them, and he was really, really frustrated with Rawhead Rex and Underworld. I mean, he was really frustrated, really angry. So he said, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it myself. So because he has that critical kind of rush behind him with Books of Blood, and then when he published Damnation Game, he has got that kind of critical mass. But I mean, Hellraiser is still a small film in the terms of it had $900,000 budget. It was tiny. It was made on on a reduced cast. Everything about it was a small piece of work essentially, and the fact that they could then spectacularize it because it kind of went further, it was horrifying. It made a name in British cinema, but it didn't have establishment respectability. I mean, Barry Norman trashed it. Variety's review of it is really something to behold. I mean, I particularly love the one where Roger Ebert hated it as well, by the way. So these, it got fan love, and I think it got hardcore fan love in particular in the British tradition of horror film. But I think it's interesting. Barker had the momentum of the literary fans. He had the endorsement by King. He got the film made. The fact that he was now a polymath, that was something else where they kind of go, wow, he's so talented. But he's rejected by the mainstream. When he tries to go more mainstream, then by going into the dark fantastic and tries to widen his readership, that's when he starts to lose hardcore horror fans. And that's where the film productions arguably get into much more trouble. So it's like you can't have both sides of you can't have your cake and eat it, Clive. So, and now he's turned into a brand in his own right, for better or worse. So it's different for him.
What do you make, Sorcha, of Barker's apparent willingness to very rapidly become Americanized through his own? Because the film was shot in this country, of course, but when it was released internationally, the voices were dubbed with American accents, and there was an attempt to make it kind of transatlantic. So what do you make of Barker's attitude in that regard?
Well, he wasn't a big fan of that idea of the mid-Atlanticism. He wasn't really into that, but it was key to kind of sell it to the American audience. There has to, as though British stories weren't relatable or something, but they had to sell it to the American audience. It was funded by New World, and I think that they kind of knew that because they got in this budget, they had to kind of play ball. I think that by the time he's making Nightbreed, and he's a director in situ in London, but trying to get this film off the ground for Fox, a company he does not understand and ends up having massive fights with, he knows that he either has to take the leap and jump into the American experience wholesale by the time he actually emigrates in 91. So by then he's kind of left it behind. I think he sees there's a brand new world out there for him to conquer, but there's that kind of the cost of that is then to leave behind the sort of the British roots of it. I mean, you notice with like the next adaptation after Nightbreed kind of tanks because it's been missold largely, but it's a very different story to Hellraiser. And I think a lot of people who went to watch Hellraiser got disappointed by Nightbreed. But when the next one, the adaptation that really takes to the American landscape is of course Candymon, which Bernard Rose updates and inputs into Chicago. And I think the fact that you have somebody else interpreting Barker works a lot better for the screen than Barker trying to do Barker with that kind of mixed metaphors, and sometimes the literary in conjunction with the commercial doesn't always necessarily take with the film. So there's that kind of lost in translation vibe, if you will.
If I could just add, like, you know, the question of the British film industry in the 1980s is a big one, and you know, not many horror films were made, and there are numerous industrial reasons as to why that was the case. But I do think it's interesting that Hellraiser is the, I mean, there was Company of Wolves, of course, and Hellraiser, but I mean, Hellraiser, the way that it was marketed, certainly on video, emphasized Pinhead because characters of that nature were renting, you know, the era of the Friday the 13th sequels and Child's Play and Nightmare on Elm Street. So Hellraiser was sold on video, at least as a monster movie, similar to the popular mainstream films of the period. And you know, Palace Pictures' Dream Demon is another one, which is like Hellraiser insofar as it goes for the sort of ethereal Lovecraftian otherworldliness vibe. Didn't do well in cinemas because it was marketed like that, but when it was released on video, was marketed as a sort of a Freddy Krueger style direct-to-video horror movie. And in that context, Sean Hudson books are not going to be adapted because, firstly, literary rights to make films are expensive, and Hudson was published by W.H. Allen, which is a major publisher, but also there just wasn't the industry infrastructure there to produce an adaptation of that sort. And that is why Slugs isn't adapted until the late 1980s by a Spanish company, because the Europeans were making those sorts of films. You know, I'm thinking of like Rat's Night of Terror, for instance, the Italian movie, which is nothing like James Herbert's The Rat, but clearly the Europeans are able to sell that globally and finance that stuff in a way that the British film industry was frankly just not prepared to do at that time.
There were a couple of, I mean, in 1980, Ingrid Pitt adapted The Dark for the director John Hoff, but that was deemed too expensive. And in 82, I can't remember his name, but the guy who was the producer of the Confessions of series with Robin Asquith, he bought The Fog and tried to get the money together to do that, and was unable to do so. And he had a screenplay which changed the lead character to an American, and they had Gene Hackman on board to play the lead character, but the money ran out. So yeah, I mean, there are a number of kind of failed Herbert projects which just fell apart because of financing.
Right, I'm going to have to move us along, guys, because, well, you very handily answered Craig's question in the midst of that, so I can jump ahead very slightly, but there are more and more questions coming in. So the next question is from Jane, and I suppose this one's for you, Sorcha, and she says, Cenobites are obviously quite wonderful. Okay, so whatever tickles your fancy. Do you think that they could be considered sites of the Freudian death drive?
Ooh. Yes, I think so. I mean, I'm gonna, just for your sake, Jane, little Pinhead to join us tonight to make it feel better. Yes, absolutely, about the death drive, about that push towards that kind of sexual excess. And as I said, he's really interested in the flesh, and he's really interested in playing with the flesh and how, what are the limits of that? What are the orgastic kind of sensibilities you can get from that? And I mean, Clive, you know, as a photographer, he's shot S&M stuff. He's really interested in that kind of extreme, well, some extreme kind of material. So it is always verging on the pornographic, but also about that idea of what does it cost you on the way. So in another way, it's around the Faustian bargain. So he's positing himself in some very traditional Gothic areas, and in other ways, he's very much about the contemporary kind of sexual excess that you get at the end of the 80s, which is still quite dangerous and upsetting and marvelous. So he's, yeah, I would agree with you on that. I think we could talk a lot more about it, but I think, yes, I think in essence they are purveyors overall that interest in the death drive.
Yeah, I mean, if anything comes out of Barker, it's that Eros and Thanatos are very much interlinked, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so a question from David. What is it about Liverpool and literary horror in the 1980s? So Keith, we'll go to you for that one.
I think it's part of Ramsay's imaginative or imaginary inheritance, his imaginative landscape, the Blitz. After he stopped imitating Lovecraft, he was able to look at scenes of urban desolation and decay and dilapidation much closer to hand, and this permeates a lot of his fiction in the 60s. Short stories, stories like Concussion, and then in the early novels as well. And he has returned to Liverpool again and again as this kind of haunted landscape, but he's also diversified. I mean, The Hungry Moon, for example, is set in an imaginary Peak District town, and a lot of his novels now have semi-rural locations. He's played with folk horror motifs a lot, and has moved more towards the an urban landscape, which is not specifically Liverpool, but it's quite close to his roots.
Sure.
I think Clive's emotionally still connected to Liverpool, but I think he hasn't really set anything in Liverpool for a very, very long time. I would consider Ramsay to be much closer to the kind of Merseyside than Clive. Not because of any kind of disinterest on Clive's part, but rather he just moved beyond it. I mean, he was desperate to get to London. He wanted to work in London, and then once he kind of did that, he moved stateside, and I think the literature followed him in that sense. I don't think he's ever really gone back to that UK-based sensibility, never mind the Liverpudlian sort of sensibility. But there was something in the water in Liverpool to create the two of them so close together, I think.
Yeah, I mean, Creatures from the Pool is very much a meditation on the history of Liverpool, and a kind of wonderful rewriting of Lovecraft's The Shadow over Innsmouth, and it's fantastically researched. He's a bona fide local historian amongst his many other talents.
Right then, so a question from Zavi, and the publication of Paperbacks from Hell in 2017, which many of you may have had a look at, and its winning of a Bram Stoker Award in 2018 seems a turning point. Why do the speakers think we are so actively re-evaluating 70s and 80s horror at this particular point in time? Is it something purely generational, i.e. formative childhood memories, or is there something about the messages in the novels and the writers themselves?
I think it's sorry.
Go on, Keith.
No, I think it's impossible to ignore or not compare the political and social environments. The 70s, consensus breaking down, the move on the political right to a much more radical consensus busting politics. Now we have right-wing authoritarian populist movements, the kind of questioning of truth by Trump and co that wouldn't disgrace a postmodernist theorist. So I think there are definite parallels there. Sorry, throw it open.
I'd say I dovetail onto what Keith has said. I think I've always kind of questioned anyone who said, oh, postmodernism is over. No. We're unfortunately seeing the full flourishing of it. And while I have most certainly been excited by the cacophony of different voices that it has enabled, it has been now weaponized, of course, against us. It has reached that full zenith. So the 80s thing, I think, is partly generational. People our age, kids the 70s and the early 80s, I think, we're coming back to that point where we are passing up. This is the life lessons we've learned. These are the authors that shaped our lives. This is what we're doing, and we pass it on to other people, and we're studying it, obviously. But I think we are seeing sort of generational, as I say, authoritarianism, fear of distrust in the government, distrust in these large voices who are lying to the public. And I think, horror will flourish because of this, because history tells us so, essentially. If you look at other periods where similar kind of movements have occurred, the culture has then become a bedrock for a really interesting horror and political sort of activism around horror as well.
Yeah. I mean, certainly I think nostalgia and critical democratization play a part as well, because I think part of this recent movement towards reevaluating these things has come from the independent publishing sector. I'm thinking of things like the Scarred for Life book and those 70s monster movie memories, where there's obviously usually male writers of a certain generation tapping into their own nostalgia for this. And that is having a great effect, I think, also upon the reevaluation of these texts. Okay, so Johnny, I've got one for you from Tris. And he says, Barker, Campbell, and Herbert managed later to adapt prose narratives and modernize. Mindful of Hudson's genre hopping, do you think he later struggled to expand from his pulpy horror comfort zone? Sorry, I think I misread that slightly.
No, it's okay. No, it's okay. I got it. No, I don't think he struggled actually, because Hudson remained a successful author into the 90s. I mean, he wasn't writing the same kind of, he wasn't writing the sort of books that made his name in the 1980s, to the point where he started to get frustrated. It's weird. It's interesting because on the one hand, Hudson embraced all the filth, as it were, but by the time you get to the 1990s and his core readership, that's what they wanted from Hudson. He wanted to branch out, and the novel that sees him branch out is the book Renegades, which is interestingly a commentary on the IRA. So that's when sort of Hudson dabbles in politics, and he starts to write dreary urban crime thrillers in the 1990s, and it's still being published by a mainstream publisher. I just think maybe the difference is Hudson was never a writer who was sold overseas in any great numbers. So Hudson's readership remained British, essentially. So whereas he perhaps didn't go on to amass the cult critical following of bigger names like Barker and Herbert, he retained a loyal readership throughout the 1990s. But inevitably, of course, the print runs got smaller, and now he's published by a publisher called Caffeine Nights, which is a small independent press. But no, I think Hudson, all things considered, did pretty well and managed to reinvent himself as an author of crime fiction. But then nowadays he's doing Hammer novelizations and stuff. So, things have come full circle, sort of.
Okay. I'm very conscious of the fact that we're approaching 8:30 and I'm getting messages from the boss that we can perhaps run over slightly. If people want to stay, by all means. So I'll move on quickly to the next question. This is from Eric, and American popular horror novelists regularly feature recurring characters and often geography as well. But this not so much in British examples of this period. Why do we think this is?
Barker does do it across his oeuvre. He does have a couple of characters that have recurring roles, but he'd be coming up to the more recent material as well. And it's stuff like, for example, in Books of Blood, you've Harry D'Amour, the detective, and then of course he returns in Scarlet Gospel. So that's just one example. So Barker does it sometimes, not very often, and he doesn't tend to do it as much as other American authors, I grant you. So, but he has done it, just in case you're wondering if he did or not.
And then just to echo Sorcha, Hudson's done it as well. He has a recurring character called Sean Doyle, who's a fan favorite. Not one of my favorites, for the record. And also Hudson's written a couple of sequels as well. His latest book actually is a sequel to Spawn from 1983, and it's called Progeny, and it's just came out last week. So there is scope for sequels and recurring characters in Hudson's work as well.
So is Campbell. Many black magicians like Peter Grace, Roland Franklin, etc., who Campbell at first used in the 60s or 70s recur in later narratives. Or if not in physical body, then at least in being dreadfully sensed or haunting the present. So he's created his own mythos, as it were. And in fact, the recent trilogy, the British trilogy, actually goes back to the Lovecraft mythos, the kind of Anglicization of the Lovecraft mythos that he started with in the 60s.
And in Herbert's case, you've got Ash, David Ash, who appears in the Ash trilogy. And the other recurring character in Herbert is Rumbo, who is a dog in Fluke who gets killed, spoiler, and returns at the end as a squirrel, and then turns up again as in the Magic Cottage as a bird, and then turns up again in once as a fox. There's this kind of little character that keeps getting reincarnated. But Herbert was asked about that, and he just said it was a joke for the fans, and he really didn't care that much. So he's never had any interest in revisiting his characters except for that one central one.
Yeah. Well, we've already touched on Liverpool, and Darren has asked, and I suppose we can open this up slightly. How significant are the geographical spaces for the horrors that the writers actually evoke?
Well, I mean, in the case of Herbert, I've said this before, but, you know, the kind of big stately country house, the gated, the big, you know, house with the loads of land and the heavy iron gates around it, they're very often these kind of places of where evil lurks. The streets of London are kind of a very interesting thing in terms of Herbert, because he used them in different ways. Obviously, you've got a certain thing in the rats, but it's that idea of the Blitz, that idea of kind of destroyed London that keeps recurring. So it's a key theme in Domain, obviously, when London is destroyed by a nuclear holocaust. And it also returns again in 48, which is set in a kind of parallel past in which the Nazis haven't won the war, but they've simply dropped this like apocalyptic pandemic disease thing that kills everybody. So you have this kind of empty London. And there's something about fenced in spaces. There's something about destroyed spaces. There's something about empty spaces that he keeps coming back to. That's the main thing. And he's always kind of southeast centric, really.
Barker does it depending on where he lives at the time. So, for example, in Damnation Game, his first novel, I mean, it's very much a meditation on London, and London as this sort of gateway to hell. Hell is a banal place, and this is London, it's Holborn in 1980s London. But by the time, you know, fast forwarding into his career a bit, when you get to Cold Heart Canyon, which I love, it's a Hollywood ghost story, essentially. It's set in his house in Beverly Hills, you know, and he transforms his house quite literally, and all the seediness of LA and Hollywood culture, and basically brings it into this kind of really interesting tapestry on what is wrong with American consumerism and American Hollywood culture and studios and all the rest of it. So he's very transformative in that sense. But I think with Barker, the big thing to think about in terms of his geography is that he's it's all, wherever we are in the world, that's one thing. There's cities, he particularly dislikes cities, but it's really always about getting to that secondary world. There's always a secondary world that informs all of his work, essentially, whether it's a gateway to hell or a gateway to another dominion, or a tapestry that comes alive and kills you, whatever it might be, it's always a secondary world that he's trying to get you into. And that takes on the kind of characteristics of the primary place that you're stuck in the novel. So it's the geography is always quite fascinating.
Right.
Yeah, with Campbell, there's a clear move from the urban, specifically Liverpudlian setting, Blitz landscape, to other urban environments. If you think about the Nameless is set in London and Glasgow quite effectively, and then afterwards he moves to other locations. London is included, but there's another dichotomy in that he has returned repeatedly to folk horror motifs. I mean, most recently with the his most recent published novel, only this year, which you know, evokes the horrific potential of ancient magic within a rural setting.
I've got a question here from Tom, and it looks like it's directed at you, Johnny, specifically, and you perhaps be able to elaborate upon this. Has Hudson ever responded to certain performers essentially parodying a lot of his work alongside the work of other horror authors and gaining critical acclaim for doing so?
I assume Tom is referring to Garth Marenghi.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Actually, speaking of which, so that's Sean Hudson there.
Sure is.
And that is essentially Garth Marenghi, right? Yeah, he has responded to it, but like, you know, he's more than happy to be part of the discourse, as it were. Hudson's, I mean, this is how he talks about it when he's interviewed, at least, is he's just happy to be entertaining people, and he's appreciative of a loyal readership. So if people are prepared, like Garth Marenghi, to take the piss out of him a little bit, but I do think that, like, Garth Marenghi, it's good, it's well-intentioned, good-natured, funny, humorous stuff. It's not in any way malicious. And I think Hudson's appreciative of the fact that somebody somewhere believes that he's still relevant, right? So yes, he has acknowledged it, and he has zero problems with it whatsoever.
So he doesn't give much of a monkeys about what Ramsey Campbell has written about him in reviews, etc.
He doesn't care, because you know, the way Hudson sees it is, or the way that he speaks about it is that, he feels the same way about the critics, as it were. They don't like him, but his readership does, and therefore that's all that he needs, because that's what pays the bills, right?
And Sorcha, I've got a question directed for you specifically, I suppose, and this one's from Carmel. And was wondering what your thoughts are on Barker's use of the queer monster as a mode of interrogating the problematic heteronormative frameworks of horror during the 1980s.
Interesting question. I think, yes, I think there's a couple of things that work there. I mean, Barker's most certainly influenced by sort of his surroundings and the kind of really interesting creative people with whom he was, you know, kind of working in his drama and in that background, and then also in part of the creative community who were writing. So he's open to these new ideas. He didn't come out at that point, at least not publicly. So he wasn't publicly out until I think maybe 93 or 94. So it's actually quite late and I think what he's doing is he's working through, I mean, anyone can read the material. You can see that there's definitely a desire to explore and to push the boundaries of heteronormativity as an ideal is not something that he's desperately interested in. That said, though, he writes women better than most horror writers I have read. So he understands women and desire in a way that I think his female readers certainly appreciated. So the heteronormativity is questioned, but it's always questioned with that idea of that actually it's all about sex and flesh. It doesn't matter what the gender attached to it is, it's all about sex and flesh and exploration. So queerness is an open, dynamic way of exploring all the potentials of both your body and your soul. So I think it's quite a liberating thing for Barker. And at a time when actually that was absolutely contravening the political dynamic, I think that's really quite exciting. So,
I've got an interesting question here from Matt, which I suppose is going into pedagogical areas almost. I'd be quite interested to hear if anyone has set any or many of these popular texts on teaching modules and how students have responded to them.
Yes. Yeah, I insisted Barker goes on our master's program of Gothic studies and they like it. You know, I mean, a lot of them have said to me they don't know who he is initially. And then when you say, well, do you know who Pinhead is? And they go, yeah. And you go, right, you know who Barker is. You just didn't realize you knew it. So they might not go through it through the cinema. But when they read Barker, and I do teach Damnation Game in particular, they often say to me that it's very visual, it's very cinematic, and they wonder why there are adaptations of some of the short stories from Books of Blood, but maybe not of the novels. But yeah, pedagogically, they do respond to it. And usually it's quite a different response to maybe teaching someone like Stephen King. They have a very different response to King, maybe because they have always known who King was because he's still so visible. So yeah, he's there anyway.
Anybody else ever set any of these writers as texts for students?
Well, next year, we're launching an MA in Sean Hudson studies. No, we're not really.
Can't be going on.
They had me for a second.
Can you imagine? That's brilliant. I love that.
I mean, I'd teach it.
Yeah, I bet you would. Yeah. And I'd sign up as well. That's the sad thing. Okay, well, I've been told by Laura that she shut off the questions at that point. So all that remains for me is to thank all of the fantastic panelists again. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege to chair this for you this evening.
Thanks,
and
Neil.
to say that hopefully we can all gather again for the next one very, very soon. So everybody stay well, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you all very, very soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Neil.
you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks so much, Neil, as well, for your excellent hosting.
Thank you,
Thank
Neil.
you.
Wonderful chairing.
Cheers, buddy.
Thanks, everybody. We will be in touch soon with our next event.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bye.